This comparative study aims to compare and contrast Chen Kaige's 1993 film Theory My Concubine from China and Xavier Dolan's 2012 film Laurence Anyways from Canada to have a concrete understanding of queer theory. This is a theory that examines gender and sexuality and challenges the heteronormative concept, which can be explained that the institution structures of understanding and practical orientations that make heterosexuality seem not only coherent, that is, organized as a sexuality, but also privileged. Different theorists around the world have contributed their thoughts to queer theory, and this comparative study will focus on Michel Foucault and Judith Butler's theory that gender is a social identity separated from the biological sex and is shaped by cultural context under social structures. Both theorists argue that gender and sexualities are not innate, but rather a process and cultural practice, and they are shaped by the social forces, what Foucault means by power, to offer us a place in the social field in which we might act, speak, and engage others. Both films demonstrate cultural context influence on gender identities, and they will be compared and contrasted specifically under social and geohistorical context. Farewell, My Concubine is a classic Chinese historical and dramatic film that centers on two Beijing opera actors, Chen and Duan Xiaolou, from the 1920s to the 1970s, where Die blurs his gender with his on-stage female characters and develops an intimate dependency on Xiaolou as they grew up together and go through drastic changes in Chinese history. The second film, Laurence Anyways, takes place in Montreal, Canada in the late 80s throughout the 90s, where Laurence discovers his identity as a woman, complicating his career as a teacher and his relationship with his parents and long-term partner, Fred. Social context significantly impacts gender identities for both Die and Laurence in the two very different films. Both characters encounter social pressure but to different extents, which shape different genders accordingly. In Farewell, My Concubine, Die is forced to play female characters as he grows up in an all-boys opera group. It is a homosocial environment that shapes Die's identity as a male, and it pressures him to act in a masculine manner, opposing to the female roles that he plays on stage. This supports Butler's performance theory that gender is not a set of free-floating attributes, for the substantive effect of gender is performatively produced and compelled by the regulatory practices of gender coherence. It makes the practice of gender one of the densest sides of power within our culture. In contrast, although Laurence resists being a male and she suffers from the social pressure against the transgender community, she lives in a much more tolerable and less cruel and violent society compared to Die's. Laurence's social pressure mostly comes from her close social group such as her girlfriend Fred. But such pressure softens as she later gains acceptance and support from her seemingly cold-hearted mother. And a new social group that shares a similar queer identity, from which she gains social power as a transgender woman. However, the fate of Die is very different as his resistance is brutally punished by others, including his most intimate person, Duan Xiaolou. Such harshness from his social group and the environment is vividly shown through the realistic style of cinematography. Eventually, he is violently forced by society to accept a queer identity as a male actor playing female roles, resulting in a successful social participation in the world of Beijing opera. Again, it supports the queer theory that sexuality and power are intertwined and cannot be parted one from another. Interesting enough, both films put their protagonists under huge social pressure as they are stared at by others in periods of silence, marking the turning points of their gender transitions. Laurence walks into a classroom in feminine clothing for the first time under her students' silent gaze.
Oui?
Ouais, c'est juste par rapport à la page 8, paragraphe 3, le remplaçant nous a pas bien expliqué ce qu'on avait à lire hier.
But for Die, the pressure forces his decision against his will.
小尼姑年方28，正青春被师傅削去了头发。我本是女娇娥，又不是男儿郎。
Despite the social context, geohistorical context also influenced Ye and Laurence genders. Fairy My Concubine depicts a very unsettling period in Chinese history, during which the governments were switched 3 times, 2 wars were fought, and a cultural revolution had taken place. This contrasts with the modern Canada in the 80s depicted in Laurence Anyways, where the Western world was paying attention and becoming inclusive for the LGBTQ+ community after the 1969 Stonewall riots in the US, which facilitated an international gay rights movement with its legacy still influencing throughout the world. On the other hand, in China's pre-reform years between 1949 and 1978, marked by centralized state socialism and Maoism, homosexual gender-variant and sexually variant individuals have commonly perceived as living in a socialist closet, fearful of social stigmatization and political persecution. This comparison supports the queer theory that sexuality is always simultaneously both highly liberatory and highly regulatory. Laurence represents the Western world to be on the libertary end, where people push against the boundaries of what is seen as normal, in which they seek to express their freedom. On the opposite, the Eastern world sees a strong link between queer liberation and Western-style political and economic modernity, which leads to its regulatory role against LGBTQ+ community. In the West, a rapid worldwide evolution and visibility is starting to be given to minorities and women in post-AIDS epidemic crisis of the early 1980s. This historical context allows Laurence to express herself as a transgender woman.
Hey, il me semble que notre génération est capable de prendre ça. On est rendu là.
Whereas Ye confronts enforced gender inversion, which he eventually uses as a social power to hide behind the dramatic makeup and costumes to survive the turmoil in China. This supports Foucault's theory that sexuality is where individuals learn how to become empowered, in which men and women express their non-adherence to what the larger society has deemed normal and abnormal. And the power simultaneously comes along with a cost, that the very terms of identity, such as queer and trans, arises out of the very institutions that regulate them. For Laurence, her transgender identity cost her career as a teacher and her romantic relationship with Fred. Overall, the significance of the 2 contrasting geohistorical contexts are expressed through different styles of mise-en-scène. Dolan maintains a flamboyant visual style, accompanied with expressive and dramatic music throughout the film, whereas Chen's film is solemn and historically accurate in terms of both mise-en-scène and music, due to the pain and heaviness of the historical context. It is also noteworthy to discuss the social and geohistorical context in the making of both films. As mentioned earlier, the Eastern and the Western worlds have drastic cultural differences in terms of perceptions of sex, gender, and sexuality. Plus, there are almost 20 years in between the release of the 2 films. Influenced by the director's cultural background, Chen takes a conservative approach that gender and sexuality are formed by cultural context. On the other hand, even though Dolan seems to make a liberal and Western conventional assertion that these identities are inborn as he omits Laurence's childhood backgrounds, it is undoubtful that the Western history of queer liberation is a prerequisite for Laurence's transition. Nonetheless of their cultural differences, both films have justified the queer theory of how cultural contexts such as society and geohistory play a significant role in shaping one's gender and sexuality.